Today, Carl and I are going to talk to you about world geography and some current thinking about the planet as a whole. Tomorrow we'll talk about Europe and a bit about Britain. If you're interested, come along tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon as well. But today is about the world. And first of all about population change and what a planet with 10 or 11 or 9 billion people might be like. We have just produced a book called Geography, which will be translated into Chinese at the end of the year. And the book has 7 maps in it. I have some postcards, so I'll hand some postcards out later with these maps on. This is one of the maps, and it's a map you probably haven't seen before. It's a map of the world where what we've done is stretch the planet to give everybody an equal amount of space. So China is here. All of this is China, because the population of China is large. This is India. We've just come from here. The UK, less than 1% of the world's population. So how many of you have seen a map like this before? Anybody seen a map? I won't ask you to put your hand up. Ah, good, one. Okay. This is very new to you, and it's a different way of looking at the planet. It's a way of looking at the planet from the point of view of people. The lines are ships moving across the oceans. And on the land there are roads, and the line shows you the cities. So it's an image of a single place where currently about 7.4 billion people live, and by the end of the century maybe about 10, 9 or 11 billion people might be living. If I go forward. Okay. This slide is showing you a series of graphs from our colleague Mark Maslin, who works at University College in London. And the slide is just to illustrate the series of problems that people worry about in the world today. This graph starts around 1950 and ends in the year 2020, and it's showing the rising amount of nitrogen that is fixed by humans on the planet because of the amount of fertilizer we have to put on the soils to make our food. This graph goes backwards in time. 800 years ago, 700, 600, 500, 400, 300, 200, 100. It's CO2 emissions, CO2 in the atmosphere, and you see the spike at the moment. That's the global warming that we're currently getting. This is the amount of surface of the planet which is being cultivated by humans. We farm almost everywhere we can farm at the moment to produce food for people. Almost the entire weight of animals in the world is produced for us. Only a tiny fraction of the weight of animals worldwide is wild. The most common bird in the world now is the chicken. People say in future we will know about our age because of the amount of chicken bones that will be in rubbish dumps, because we eat so many chickens now. And the last graph is about mass extinctions, because we're in the 6th mass extinction. The number of animals and birds and plants which are dying out forever. It has happened before, but this is the first time it's happened in human history. So this is all bad news. This all looks very bad. And it is because of these changes that people worry about a global population of 10 billion people. But what I want to try to show you, and I'm only going to speak for another 35 minutes, and then I want you to ask me some questions. What I want to try to show you is why we shouldn't be as worried as we are about global population change. And to do that, we have to look out. We have to go back in time And you have to have a wider perspective on what's just happened. In the last 150 years, the population of human beings on the planet has risen 6 times, a 6-fold increase. The last time world population increased 6 times was when we began to farm. This map is showing the first sites of agriculture as they're thought to have developed around the world. So agriculture began in China, began in the Middle East, began in various sites in Africa, and independently began in the Americas. When people settled down to farm, and they were often forced to settle to farm because the population of humans who were moving around, called hunter-gatherers, was too high. Once we got farming worked out well, the number of people who could be supported on the land increased 6 times. And then after farming was established, population only rose very, very slightly and very steadily. 0.1% a year, less than 1.1% a year. We had a great era of stability between the beginning of farming and around 1850. And then after 1850, in the last 160 years, we've had another enormous population increase because we've changed from farming to living in cities. And the current transformation is as important as the transformation to farming was. This city is a great example of this. This city hardly existed 200 years ago. It has all suddenly appeared in that short amount of time. So why did we get the current transformation? We guessed that people began farming because they couldn't survive by gathering crops and by hunting anymore because there weren't enough animals to be hunted. People were picking too many crops and they began to cultivate. But we don't know that much about why we began to live in cities so quickly in the last few hundred years. In the last few decades, a consensus has been reached. People have, in large numbers, began to agree that the key date, the most important date, was 1492. Until 1492, the world was split in 2 parts. The old world, you can see it up there, and the new world, the Americas. And the parts for human beings had been separated. And the civilizations on both sides of the planet, the Americas and the old world, were quite stable. They changed every so often, every few hundred years. One dynasty would take over from another. The Roman Empire would rise and it would fall. You'd have different civilizations in the Americas. But they'd each be replaced by something that was quite like the last civilization. All based on farming. Until 1492. Before 1492, where I come from, which is Europe, was one of the most backwards places on the planet. It was cold, wet, we didn't produce very much which was of much interest to anybody else. Nobody wanted to buy what we made because we were not particularly good at making it. After 1492, this is a picture of Columbus arriving, I think in Hispaniola. After 1492, what really was Western Asia, what's now called Europe, became the centre of the trading world, simply by chance. And that changed a whole set of different things. This is showing the movement in all the animals that moved across the planet, which hadn't existed before on one side. So, pigs and horses, dandelions. I'm not going to ask if anybody knows what a dandelion is. Grapes, rice, bananas, sugar and wheat all moved from the old world to the new world. Cattle and goats and sheep and chickens, smallpox, the disease, measles and typhus all moved that way. Going back the other way, maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, peanuts, squashes, pumpkins, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, pineapple, cocoa, tobacco and quinine. It's an incredible movement of species and animals. But what we haven't put on this slide, and what made Europe, and originally Spain and Portugal, so rich, was they got silver and gold, but particularly silver from here. And the silver was moved on ships over here, and the silver worked its way around to China, and suddenly China started sending things back this way, because suddenly Europe had something that the most developed countries in Asia wanted, which was gold and silver. If there hadn't been silver in the Americas, things would have changed very differently, but there was silver in the Americas. And then we began moving people. Millions and millions of slaves from Africa were moved to plantations. Cotton was grown, other crops were grown, sugar was harvested. All these crops came back. And what had been a fairly stable world system for centuries began to be rearranged, began to be upset. This is a map showing all the voyages of trading ships in the 18th and 19th century in the world. And this is an incredible change. You go from 1492 and 3 tiny little ships going across the ocean, and this being a barrier when nobody went across, to just a few hundred years later the Atlantic becomes the busiest set of sea lanes in the world. This has happened within the last 20 or 30 generations. It is not that long ago, and it's an incredible change. And so suddenly somewhere which was on the edge, which really didn't matter, ends up being in the middle. There are incredible changes of thinking that occurred after 1492. This year is the 500th anniversary of a book called Utopia by Thomas More. Utopia is the idea that you can have an ideal society. Thomas More was doubting that. Utopia was based on an island. Thomas More was a teenager when the Americas were first reached. Copernicus, just 20 years after people had first crossed that ocean and connected the old world to the new world, Copernicus develops the idea that the Earth is not in the centre of the universe, but the sun is in the centre. Now we now know the sun is not in the centre of the universe, but that was a huge shift in thinking. People began to doubt their complete belief in gods in the way they had done before, because if God existed, why hadn't God told them about the Americas? Our thinking changed, and that change in thinking made many other things possible. And it all dates back to that date. I may be overclaiming it a little bit, but it does seem to be an explanation about why change happened then. This is a picture of a man called René Descartes. And René Descartes was a philosopher, and just 140 years after the crossing of the Atlantic, René Descartes was on the docks in a city called Amsterdam, which is now in the Netherlands. And this quote from him, I think, explains what was beginning to happen and what was new. So I'll read it out to you. He noted when he was a young man in 1631 in the docks in Amsterdam that all around him people had stopped thinking about much more than just earning money. People wanted to earn money and become rich. He said, in this great city where I am living, with no man apart from myself not being involved in trade, everyone is so intent on his profits that I could spend my whole life without being seen by anyone. Amsterdam at that time was becoming the richest place on the earth. The United Provinces, which later became the Netherlands, in what was called Holland, grew rich on trade. Trade suddenly grew and grew and grew because of the impetus of all those crops and all those people, because of the disturbance of the Americans. This is the only table of numbers I have, but I thought I'd just put it up to relate these things and show how tiny these parts of Europe were, how incredibly unimportant they were. And it was just geographical coincidence that they happened to be at the place which first connected to the New World. The Netherlands, or what is now the Netherlands, the current border of the Netherlands, around about the time René Descartes was talking, only had a population of 1 million people. By 1820 it had a population of 2 million people. But its population growth in the 16th century was 58%. And if you look down, you'll see that was the highest growth of any of these parts of the world in the 16th century. The United Kingdom, which took over from the United Provinces to become the richest country in Europe and the world afterwards, had a population of just 4 million, rising to 21 million by 1820, a 39% increase in the 17th century. In contrast, China, which was the most developed place in the world at this time, 103 million people rising to 381, with a drop of population in the 17th century. And I won't go through the rest of the table, but you can see the destruction that occurred to populations in Latin America. Because when Europeans arrived, they brought diseases that killed millions and millions of people, which made it very, very easy to colonize Latin America. There's a book called Guns, Germs and Steel by Jared Diamond, if you're interested in the history of these things. All those changes of thinking eventually made it possible for somebody like Charles Darwin, but there were many other people at the same time as Darwin, to develop an origin of species and to say that we were simply another animal. This was an incredible change of thinking. And it's very recent. Charles Darwin was writing only when my great-great-great-great-grandparents were alive. It's a very short amount of time. He also wrote something that I think is very interesting. He was talking about elephants and about cabbages. But talking about elephants, he said, after a period of about 750 years, there will be 90 million elephants alive, descended from their first pair. But this would occur if they had had 2 or 3 favourable seasons. What Charles Darwin was doing was trying to describe a population explosion in a species. Every so often, algae in the water, fish, certain mammals, their population numbers suddenly rise very, very quickly due to 1 or 2 favourable seasons. Everything is okay for that species and it just shoots up in size. What was interesting about this is that what Charles Darwin was describing in 1849, and he didn't know he was describing it, was what was just about to happen to human beings. Human beings' population exploded around about 1859, 1850. Just got one important graph to show you. This is the most important graph. I'm not showing you the simple graph that lies behind this. The simple graph is a population around about 1 billion people in the world then, rising to about 7 billion people now. And the graph looks like that. That's the simple graph, which is the one I don't want to show you. This is the complicated graph. This is the graph about the change in population. It's the annual increase in population every year in the world. And if you remember I said before, we had changes of about 0.1%. Very, very slow population growth for century after century. After that increase that occurred when we began to farm, very, very long time ago. 1850, the world population was almost stable, but it was rising in France, it was rising in the Netherlands, and it was rising in the United Kingdom. And then the rate of growth, the rate of change itself begins to increase, and increases again, and reaches 1% by 1900. This is the First World War, but much more importantly, because the First World War was not a world war. The First World War was a tiny local war in Europe, which wasn't very important. But Europe had become so rich that it could call it a world war and get away with it. The much more important thing that happened here was an influenza pandemic that maybe killed as many as 50 million people. But it was a very small thing in world history. Population growth rises again. We get an economic crash. It dips slightly. We get a Second World War, which really was a world war. But then population growth goes up and up again. It dips in the 1960s, China. It goes up again to peak around about 1971. Around about 1971, the population of the planet, the human population of the planet, is growing by 2% every year. Now there was a very clever mathematician in the 1960s who tried to explain that this couldn't carry on. And the way he explained it is he said if you have population growth of 2% a year, and that was to carry on for another 300 years, then in 300 years' time, the entire planet would be covered in a mass of human bodies, all touching each other. So, about 5 or 6 times the density of people in this room, over the entire planet. What that should have told people in the 1960s and 70s was that they were living through very unusual times. This growth rate simply couldn't continue. And if you look back at the growth rate, then you see that the real spurt of growth, apart from this emissional change, began shortly after the Second World War, and it began in a baby boom. So a baby boom in Europe, when soldiers came back from the war, a baby boom in America, but also a baby boom, many more babies in India, with independence, and a baby boom in China, after the revolution. And that baby boom resulted in a second baby boom, the babies of those babies in the 1960s. But then, after 1971, partly because of China, but not all because of China, happened across the world, the rate of growth begins to fall. It falls and falls. Little like here, this was the East African famine that killed many people, and then when many people die, they have babies again. That's what happens when you get a sudden disaster. People have babies after disasters. And then it falls and falls and falls. I stopped in 2000. It's actually carried on falling to 2015. Even faster than before. About 2 years ago, the United Nations projected that our population would reach 11 billion rather than 10. And I think that's because they were looking at what's called an echo of a baby boom. But if you look at the most recent years of fertility data around the world, we're probably not going to make 11 billion. We're heading much more quickly towards 10 billion people. We have to get down here to get no more population growth. We could get to zero if you take this line and carry it down by about 2100 in about 84 years' time. Maybe less, maybe more. But what appears to be happening is that our population explosion worldwide is coming to an end. The majority of people on the planet now live in areas where people have less than 2 children each. In Hong Kong it's heading towards 1%, in Shanghai it's 1 child, Shanghai 1, Tokyo 1 child, in Barcelona 1 child. If you have 1 child you have a halving. The reduction in population is very, very good news. There is no sign anywhere in the world of that reduction reversing, but it doesn't help you very much if you decide you're going to burn more oil and more coal, as I suspect as geography students you well know. And so this graph is just showing how little we get from hydroelectric energy in the world at the moment, how much we're getting from oil and gas at the moment. And there are many efforts to change this, but they're not happening fast enough. But population stabilisation should make it much easier for people to see why it is worth trying to change the energy that we use. If the population was still rising, then the point of trying to change your energy uses would be less obvious. But as the population is decelerating, the rise is continuing, but the rate of rise is decelerating, it makes much more sense to worry about green energies. The other very important thing to say about population change, you remember I said we're about 7.3, 7.4 billion people now on the planet. Most of the increase that is going to come is us. And more of it is you than me and Carl, because we're older. Is aging. Most of the increase is people already born like you, living to be 70, 75, 80, 85 or 90 years old. If life expectancy in the world doubles, then the number of people on the planet at any one time doubles without you having to have any more babies. And currently there is no sign of a slowdown in life expectancy improving. But the good news on fertility is there's also no sign of health getting worse for children. Currently, infant mortality rate in China is very, very close to the infant mortality rate in the United States. It's just 0.1, 0.2% above. Within about 18 months, the United States and China's infant mortality rate may well be the same. And when infant mortality rates are really, really low, when children don't die in the first year of life, people have less children, regardless of policies about children. The lowest infant mortality rate in the world at the moment, I think, is in Iceland, and it's just 2 children for every 1,000. So we're looking at very stable human population coming, very good chance of survival, and then much more emphasis on how people consume, how they waste, what they do with their lives, rather than worrying about the numbers of people that there are. I am much more sure than the official projections. The official projections, these are from a year ago, show the actual number of people, 1 billion, 6 billion by the year 2000, 7.3 billion by now, and then a central projection which said about 9 billion by 2100, it's now at about 10, it was 11, it's gone back to 10, settling to 8.5 by 2020. And then there are two other main projections. This is the one everybody worries about, the high projection. Everybody ignores this one. There is nothing sophisticated about these two projections. They're produced by the United Nations. And all they do is they take their standard projection for the world and they assume that every woman has 1/2 an extra baby. And that's the high projection. That's all it is. Global population estimates are very, very simple. And the low projection assumes 1/2 a less baby. So 1 less baby amongst every 2 women. This, I think, is much more interesting than this. Because if you look at the places which are most ahead in time, which are the cities, and the cities which are developing fastest, the places which are economically most successful, you see really fast reductions in fertility there. The United Nations assumes that at some point in the future, 100, 200, 300 years, the world will level off with every couple having 2 children. But there's no reason to believe that will happen. If you look at Europe, what you see is that about 1 in 4 couples are now having no children. Half of them find they cannot have a child and want to, the other half are choosing of that quarter. And then the most common family in Europe is 2 children just, but after that 1 child, and 3 is no longer normal, 4 is very, very rare. As soon as you switch from 2 to 1, and 1 becoming normal in all these places that haven't had a single child, it changes what's happening in many parts of the world. And that is what's most interesting to look at for population projections. Because all I'm saying is, look at that bottom line on the graph rather than the top line, because the bottom line, moving down towards the bottom line, we won't go down to 3 billion, but we always ignore the bottom line, and I think it's silly. So this is that map again. You need to start thinking of some questions for me. This is a map of the world shaped by population. This map appeared in Nature, I think around 2004. It was drawn by a man called Mark Newman. And it's a map I'm very, very used to. But it's a map that you haven't seen before. So if you think about those population projections and think how it's going to change, the country that's going to shrink most very soon is actually Japan. Because Japan has a very high number of elderly people, they will die, relatively small number of children, 1.3 children, 1.2 children per couple. China is about to shrink, of course. India, not shrinking yet, but will. Africa is going to grow larger. Not usually larger, and Africa's, it's also worth remembering, is relatively small compared to what it used to be, because of taking all the people from Africa to the Americas. It wasn't the actual people moving to the Americas that reduced the population. It was the destruction caused to Africa by the slave trade and by the colonies that reduced the population of Africa, and all the people who died on the crossings. Europe is about to shrink. Every country in Europe is about to shrink. Some countries are already shrinking. Nowhere in Europe do people have 2 children per couple. In a very good year in Britain, we might get up to 1.9, but only because a whole set of women have delayed having children, and we have a large number of people who suddenly come into the country and are of the right age to have children, and even then we only get to 1.9. Germany is shrinking. Even with 1 million Syrian refugees coming into Germany, Germany is still going to shrink. In the United States, in recent years, a best-selling book was published about the shrinking middle class. The middle class, the better off section of society in the United States, is having less than 2 children per couple. The only reason that the United States had on average slightly over 2 children per couple was immigration. Immigration traditionally, on average, involves people moving from poorer areas to richer areas. People in poorer areas or poorer countries tended to have slightly more children. When you arrive, say, from Mexico into the United States, you would have less children than you would have had if you stayed in Mexico, but slightly more than the average United States. And that led to population growth in countries like the UK and the United States, and not in other countries which had less immigration. But that's coming to an end. Recently, the presidential candidate Donald Trump suggested building a wall across the Mexican border. What Trump didn't know is that more people at the moment going back from the United States to Mexico than go from Mexico to the United States. So if you built a wall, you wouldn't actually reduce the population of the United States. This is a map that you would have seen before, but you haven't seen it looking like this before. This is the map of the Earth at night. Do you know this map? On a normal map it shows you where all the cities are. And I saw a version of it in the lab downstairs. So, this is Tokyo, this is Cairo, this is London, this is New York. But what we've done on this map is we've stretched it so that everybody gets the same amount of space. So there are people living everywhere. This is the Sahara Desert. We make the desert disappear. We make mountains disappear. We make places with many people get larger. So on this map, Moscow is up there at the top. You can see central planning produces a very neat city. On this map, you can actually see where people are wasting light, where they're shining light up. Whereas on the normal map, it tells you where people are. But this is, if you like, a map of light pollution. So, the population is increasing in Africa, but people in Africa do not waste energy as much as people in other parts of the world. There are many other problems to worry about. I'm coming to an end in just a minute. We are currently seeing global inequalities and income and wealth rise again. They rose to a peak around the year 1913. Just over 100 years ago, was the most unequal the world had ever been in terms of gaps between rich and poor. And then inequalities between rich and poor fell and reduced in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. We became more equal. But then worldwide from the 70s onwards we began to see inequalities in wealth and income rising. We saw them rise most in places like the United States and United Kingdom. We saw them rise less in places like Scandinavia, Norway and Japan. But we've seen them rise in China. Very similar pattern. They fell all the way to the early 1970s. Then, 1978 onwards, inequalities begin to rise again. And also rise in India. A very unequal world is potentially a very polluting world, because when some people have a lot of income and wealth, they buy big cars, they drive their big cars around, you get a lot of pollution from the cars. In a more equal country, people build public transit systems, which are far less polluting. In an unequal country like the United States, business people in the United States fly small planes everywhere, which is incredibly damaging to the environment. In a more equal country like Germany, people who work for businesses use the train system to move around. There's growing evidence. An economist called Thomas Piketty and a colleague recently showed that the greater inequality you have in a country, the more carbon dioxide pollution you get in that country, which is why we have to worry about these inequalities between rich and poor. And also, just to come back to the beginning, it relates to fertility. Because when people are poor, they tend to have more children. So if you allow billionaires to take more and more of the money, and don't allow people at the bottom of society to see their living standards rise, people at the bottom of society will have more children. The range, this is the UN range of probabilities, it's very wide. It is really quite remarkable that we do not know just 84 years' time, 2100, when your children will be alive. We don't know whether there will be 5 million people or 14 billion people, 5 billion or 14 billion people on the planet. But my best guess is that we're looking at 9 or 10 again at the moment. And every year you can see the statistics and you can get an idea of what is happening with births. It is very important how many people we have. And I think it illustrates just how uncontrolled the world is, that there is just such a range of possibilities. I'm trying to give you an idea of why there's such a range, of why we needn't be so afraid as we are about future population numbers now. Things are settling down. And why, if you go back from 6 billion to 1 billion in 1850, and then back to 1492, you can see what triggered this off, what started it to happen, and you can begin to see the end of the process. So we're living through a transition, an incredible transition of human beings worldwide in just a few favoured generations, those favoured generations that Charles Darwin talked about. This is my last slide. And the implication of all of this is that we have choices. If I was talking to you in 1968 or 1971, and I had this data, I was just alive then, I could talk by 1971. If I was talking to you then, it would all look really, really bad. It would look out of control. It would be very hard to be positive about the future then. Just 2 generations later, it's possible to say that this kind of thing is not a utopian pipe dream. It is achievable. The rate of change that has occurred in the world is so fast that we could live in sustainable cities in 2 or 3 generations from now. But at the same time, this comes from Planet of the Apes, which I suspect was produced around about the 1970s. At the same time, we're quite capable of environmental destruction and of not being able to live on the planet the way we currently do. The importance of population geography and the importance of world population projections is it shows you that that choice is actually there. We are not inevitably heading towards that. We have a choice to do that. We've only recently come to realise that we have that choice. You only have to go back in geography to when I was taught geography when we didn't even know that we had man-made climate change occurring. When I was taught geography at school, I was taught that a glaciation was about to begin, and that the glaciers would come down and the future would be colder and there'd be more ice. So our thinking is changing very quickly. Our thinking will change again. There are things I've said to you just now which will be wrong. We don't have all the answers, and large numbers of people can get many things wrong at the same time and begin to convince themselves that they're right. But whatever does happen, it is certainly going to be very interesting, and it is worth your while watching what the global statistics do over the next few years, and comparing what they say about population change to what they said was going to happen a few years ago, because that gives you a degree of knowledge about the uncertainty that we currently have, but also some certainty that we are turning into a species that no longer has, on average, as we had for thousands of years, 6, 7 or 8 children, most of whom died. We're turning into a species that has 0, 1 or 2 children across the whole of the planet. And that's very different. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.